Why do we care about carbohydrates so much? And why are carbohydrates often referred to as the bad guy? It really indicates that we have a lot to learn in terms of carbohydrates and why they're important for performance. And I also have to say, important for health. So the carbohydrates are made primarily of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The structure is a little bit different. You'll see that it's either a 6 or a 5 ring structure. And we have glucose and galactose as being the 6 ring. Fructose is a 5 ring. These are primarily formed by plants via photosynthesis and stored in plants as starch. Carbohydrates are classified as simple or complex based upon how many base structures are linked together. So mono is 1, di is 2. Complex means that there are multiple. The simple carbohydrates, mono and disaccharides, are glucose, galactose, fructose, sucrose, lactose, and maltose. And what you can probably tie in is glucose, as we carry that in our blood. That's our available carbohydrate that we utilize. Fructose we have with fruit. Sucrose is table sugar. Lactose is found in milk. And maltose is found in grains. The complex carbohydrates are primarily longer chains. 3 to 10 sugars is an oligosaccharide, and polysaccharides are greater than 10 sugars in a chain. Now, glycogen is a polysaccharide, and that is stored. It's the stored form of glucose, and it is metabolized and to produce glucose for metabolism in our body. Fiber is also a carbohydrate. We have non-digestible and soluble versus insoluble. Well, I should say fiber is non-digestible, and it can be either soluble or insoluble. That means that it can be dissolved in water. Our soluble fibers are those that are found in fruits and veggies. Insoluble is found more in nuts. Functional fiber is the non-digestible component of food. And so you'll think of cellulose as an example. If it's commercially made, it is an isolated form. So that would be like guar gums and so forth. When you add the dietary and the functional fiber, you get the total fiber for the food. So when you look at the fiber on a label, it's going to have the culmination or the addition of what's found naturally in that dietary fiber and also the functional fiber. Now, for a food to be identified as high fiber, it has to contain about 20% of the daily recommended value in reference to the amount consumed. So it's a high fiber food if it has 20% of the recommended value. It's 10 to 19% if it's a good source. Now, athletes do need to be mindful of how they feel with fiber. So avoiding high fiber foods prior to an event is going to be something that we need to consider. We're not going to recommend black beans an hour before an individual runs a marathon. Here are some high carbohydrate foods broken into complex versus simple. And you'll see that we have naturally present simple and added simple. And we tend to get an excessive amount in our Western diet through added simple. What's the function of carbohydrate? Well, we know that it's necessary for our nervous system, and the amount that's required, that recommended daily amount, is what's needed by the brain. And so we have a relatively small amount that's required. Although for an athlete and for performance and recovery, we need more than that amount. It's important to remember 4 calories per gram, and also as a reminder that it's really the primary source for high intensity anaerobic exercise. Carbohydrate primes the metabolic pathway so we can use other sources. The primary other source that we use is fat. It's important because fat is going to be able to be used for metabolism, but during exercise, unless it's very low intensity, we're primarily using carbohydrates. So it's just how it is. So with fat, we're going to not rely heavily on that fat metabolism unless it's a real long duration and lower intensity. Carbohydrates are going to be necessary. Now, our body can make carbohydrates to be used for metabolism. I don't want to bypass that. Having carbohydrates prevents the breakdown of protein in the body. So when we have the ability for protein to be integrated into the metabolic pathways, it has to be deaminated. And it's deaminated, and it can be inserted into the metabolic pathway or sent to the liver to manufacture new glucose, which is gluconeogenesis. That means new glucose from a non-carbohydrate form. We want to keep our protein on board, and we don't want to use that for fuel. So carbohydrates are important for sparing our muscle tissue. The recommendations come in 2 ways. Now, the RDA is 130 grams for adults and children, and again, that's just how much the brain needs per day. But the range of what we need for performance can be calculated 2 ways. It can be calculated by body weight or by percentage of total calories. The caloric requirement for the athlete needs to be known when we identify the percentage of total calories. And you'll see for both of these, especially by body weight, that's a big range, 3 to 12 grams per kg. We're going to take a look at a calculation in just a second so you know how to do that. What we need is going to vary, and this will be on a table in a couple slides. The recommendations are based upon when the person is in their training schedule, when they're competing, their body weight, and also their total calories. So let's calculate a requirement, and trust me, you'll need to know how to do this. So here is an example, and there's also one in your textbook. Steve is a 78 kilogram athlete who needs 3,500 calories per day, and he is doing moderate training, which is about an hour per day. So to calculate his requirement based upon percent of calories, we simply take his caloric need times the percentage converted into a decimal, and that equals, in this case, 1,750 calories. But that's not really helpful. We want to know how many grams a person should consume. So then we divide the total calories by 4 calories per gram, and we come up with 438 or 437.5 grams. Now I'll tell you, you can have a decimal in your grams, but you can't have a decimal when you calculate calories. So let's just get that out there right now. You can't have 2,999.87 calories. It just doesn't work because we've already rounded our calories to the whole number. We want to have whole numbers. So let me say, if it's 50% of, if we look at that recreational athlete, 50 to 55%, we've calculated his grams to be 438 or 437.5 grams. That's just the bottom level. Now, to determine what's going to work out for this athlete, It's helpful, a little hint is to get a list of foods that the individual typically consumes. Then you look to see what foods are good sources of carbohydrates, and we balance out the foods the person already likes and give them the right amount. Now, this is assuming that this person doesn't eat angel food cake as their only source of carbohydrates. Now, if we look at it the other way, we still have Steve, the 78 kilogram athlete who exercises moderately. If we look at and I just picked 7, if 7 grams per kg, the range was 3 to 12, and that goes from somebody who's exercising very low, or somebody that is 12 would be somebody who's exercising intensely. We're looking at, for this individual, 5 to 7 grams. I'm just going to calculate 7 here. So as we look at just body weight and times 7 grams per kg, boom, we right away get his value, and that's 546 grams. Now, if we want to determine how that fits out with his percentage of total calories, because that's important to do as well, we take those grams, which would be 546 times 4 calories per gram, and we end up with 2,184. And to determine what percentage that is of his total caloric intake, the math equates to about 63%, which is a little bit higher than what that recreational athlete value of 50 to 55% was. So let's compare those calculations. 50 to 55%, we have 437.5 grams to 481. If we use the range associated with the body weight recommendations, we get something a little bit higher. Now, as you can imagine, this is going to change when somebody has a greater caloric need. So we're looking at those elite athletes, for example, that have long duration activities. Again, I'm going to talk about the Tour de France. You can be sure they need much more than that. Now, I will say that the Tour de France athletes do tend to have a lower body weight, but they still need a higher amount of carbohydrate intake simply because of the work that they're doing that requires so much carbohydrate. And they also need to be hydrated, which comes later on. So what we want to do is we need to compare our methods, and we want to know what the typical diet is. We want to make recommendations about what somebody likes and dislikes. If somebody hates lentils, we're not going to recommend lentils. We also need to know when they're training. If they're tapering, their caloric intake is going to go down. We will want to make some adjustments. And timing has to do with when the exercise, especially for a long endurance, we want to make sure that we're feeding the nutrition, the feeding during that activity is maintained. Here's that nice table that gives you an idea about carbohydrate recommendations based upon weight. And I looked at moderate training, which is about an hour per day, and so I used the range of 5 to 7 grams per day. Now, if Steve was doing high volume or extreme commitment, we know we would have to up his carbohydrate intake, but we also know that his caloric intake we'd have to up his carbohydrates, but we also know his caloric intake would be elevated too. Think about Michael Phelps with his swimming, big guy, lots of training. His caloric intake requirement was somewhere around like 7,000 calories. He had to eat and eat and eat. He had to get enough carbohydrate, but he also had to have higher fat food to be able to get the calories that he needed. Where do we get our carbohydrates? Lots of sources. There are foods that we want to have more of, and that would be our whole grains and use sparingly our refined grains. There are a couple slides or tables in your book that I want to refer you to that has to do with how to get foods into meals and snacks. So take a look at these, and when you're making recommendations, we want to be kind of creative in terms of how we can get the calories and the carbohydrates into that individual's diet. And so this smoothie has good calories, tells you what the protein intake and also the fat intake, and it works really well. It's tolerated well, and who doesn't like bananas and peanut butter? How do you use um, snacks? Get carbohydrate-rich dairy or dairy alternatives. You can use yogurt. I actually am a lover of granola in my yogurt. That's one of my favorite things. I also like to add almonds to my cottage cheese. Who knew? It's actually good. Pistachios are good in cottage cheese too if you like cottage cheese. Um, you can use milk instead of water to make soup, and it's a matter of finding out what that person likes to eat. A relatively new area of interest is studying the gut microbiota, especially with exercise. There's quite a bit more research in terms of nutrition than what's compared to the impact of exercise, but that could be a whole nother class. As far as we know with carbohydrates and gut microbiota, the microbiota is basically the diversity of the microbes that live in your gut. The importance of it is that it impacts so many parts of your uh, digestion, immune function, uh, serves as potentially being antibacterial, keeping the bad bacteria out, keeps your inflammation down. It's important for nervous system function. We know that individuals that have a poor microbiota could potentially have poor serotonin and have greater depression. So there's what's called the gut-brain axis. It's important for endocrine function, for blood glucose control, satiety, definitely a role in chronic disease. So there's so much more to learn about it. Now, as far as diet goes, there are a number of things that can positively impact your gut microbiota. I will tell you I added a few more than what was in your book, but fiber is really important, partially because there's components in fiber that stimulate the gut, and the right kinds of foods, healthy fats like avocados, nuts, olive oil, but primarily variety. Foods, cocoa, moderation of red wine, those are polyphenols, any kind of fermented foods. This would be like fermented pickles, taking the right amount of probiotics and prebiotics in the right way. And the issue that we need to be concerned about would be what negatively impacts in terms of nutrition. So it has been indicated that consistently remember, too much is never good. Really high protein, really high saturated fat, low fiber, refined sugar and high fructose corn syrup are both inflammatory. Those can impact your microbiota and also be associated with chronic disease. Excessive alcohol, caffeine is fine. It's when we look at that excessive amount that we get into trouble. How much? Oh man, so much work is needed to be done. And finally, in the reading, you'll see there's something about the glycemic index and the glycemic load. Really, that all depends. Glycemic index was identified especially significant for individuals that have diabetes. It has to do with how an individual food, otherwise known as an isolated food, influences blood glucose. So the reference is a slice of white bread, and everything's compared to what happens if you eat the same, I think it's 50 grams of a food, it's a specific amount. How does the blood glucose change over a 2-hour period? The glycemic load is more how much do you typically eat. So instead of, and it also has mixed foods. So it's the glycemic index, and there's a chart with all the glycemic index of foods and the carbohydrate content. And say you don't, if the glycemic index of a carrot is 50 grams of carrot, but you eat more than 50 grams of a carrot, that would be utilizing the glycemic load instead of the glycemic index. How valuable is it? It isn't clear. So we don't emphasize this so much.